What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So in my last video, I discussed some of the issues that I felt starter decks are currently facing in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And how I feel that starter decks really have to evolve to keep up with modern Yu-Gi-Oh! In general. But I thought for today's video, I would go ahead and take some initiative and bring you guys my top 5 decks for beginners. Now, these decks aren't necessarily going to be budget decks necessarily, although most of the decks on this list are incredibly cheap if you're building them from scratch, but I'm talking about decks specifically that are coherent enough but also basic enough that you could give them to a new player and really teach them the basics of how the game is played. But before we get into that, I want to give a huge shout out to my newest patrons as always. So big shouts today to James as well as Michael. You guys are the reason that this channel is growing strong. And if you guys want to help support me in the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. Starting off with number 5, I've got Evil Swarm. Now, Evil Swarm has a lot of good parts here that I really like, especially for beginners. The main monster lineup has monsters that don't really do anything just outstanding, but really do enough to get the deck in a good position. I mean, you've got a card like Evil Swarm Caster, which bestows you with an additional normal summon in a turn. You've got a card like Mandragora, which I made fun of in the starter deck video, but when you have it in the deck it's meant to be played in, it's actually a pretty good card. Then you've also got stuff like Evil Swarm Kirkion, which is really good for graveyard recursion and teaching you kind of how you can just get cards back out of the graveyard and then proceed to combo off with them. And then you have cards like Evil Swarm Thunderbird, which is good at being able to dodge certain types of removal and kind of teaches you the basic fundamentals of chain links. You also have a very powerful boss monster in Evil Swarm Ophion, and not only is Evil Swarm Ophion a very good stun tool, but it also has the ability to search out cards to not only help protect itself, but also to kind of help you filter your hand and really get to the types of cards you want to be seeing. In addition to that though, you're basically going to be playing a very control-ish like deck, probably playing a lot of traps. I think that might be said for a lot of the decks on here, but I think that's very good because it kind of teaches you how, summons work, normal and special summoning, especially when you get into Xyz summoning. It kind of teaches you the basics of that. It does a lot for not really having a lot of cards that do anything ridiculous, and that's what I really like about it. Evil Swarm is a little bit meta dependent depending on what cards are going to exist, because Evil Swarm is a little bit outdated and high level monster decks haven't really been relevant since Dragon Ruler, but I think it's a very good starting point, and that's why I put it as number 5. But getting on to number 4, we have a deck that I think is slightly better because it's a little bit more well-rounded defensively, and that deck is Geargia. Now, I think back around the time of about 2014, 2015, this was one of the best decks. It actually had a format named specifically after it. Now, again, the main monsters of this deck are actually really straightforward. You've got Geargia Armor, which is essentially the heart and soul of the deck, which emphasizes the setting mechanic, and it also can reset itself to the field while also generating you card advantage, so it kind of teaches the basics of how an engine kind of works. You also have cards like Geargia Accelerator, which bestows you with an extra special summon. Geargia Arsenal, which allows you to search for your Geargia armor, so it kind of teaches about tutoring. And then you've got a crazy boss monster in Gear Gigant X. Now, the reason Gear Gigant X is so good is, again, it doesn't do anything ridiculous, at least by 2018 standards, but the fact that this is a deck that can generate a ton of advantage is really what makes this deck so appealing. And then you've got crazy cards like Geargia Gear, which on paper and maybe by 2018 standards might not look that powerful, but back in the day, flipping a Geargia Gear would be like the 2018 equivalent of resolving a Scapegoat. That's how crazy powerful this card was. So it kind of teaches you how you can use trap cards during the end phase to kind of go for a power play on your following turn. It's another rank 4 toolbox deck, so you've got access to all the powerful rank 4s in the game, and again, you're going to be having a bunch of traps to kind of help ensure that you can control the game, generate a ton of advantage without having to do anything too complex. The decision trees of this deck are fairly straightforward, straightforward, and that's what I really like about it. I like it better than Evil Swarm because it's a bit more well-rounded, even though Evil Swarm has a lot more just power behind it in terms of how big the monsters are, but I think that the consistency and the fact that it generates so much advantage is why it had to take the number 4 slot. But this moves us on to my number 3 deck, and that deck is going to have to be Satellar Knights. Now, in the video discussing the starter decks, I did mention how Satellar Knights were one of my ideal archetypes I would like to see a starter deck based around, because starter decks really just need kind of some sort of theme to kind of tie it all together to really show synergy within archetypes, because Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a heavily archetype-reliant game. You've got Deneb, which searches any Satellar Knight from the deck, Altair, which recurs from the graveyard, Vega, which special summons another Satellar Knight from the hand, Unuklahai, which dumps Satellar Knights, which in tandem with cards like Altair and even Call of the Haunted, Oasis of Dragon Souls, really kind of just shows how a well-oiled machine, I guess I should have said that with Gear really works, especially when you start getting into more higher levels of casual and competitive play. What I like about Satellar Knights in comparison to maybe Geargia or Evil Swarm is that it's even more well-rounded than those other decks, and actually has been able to compete at semi-competitive levels even by 2018 standards. Some people have taken Satellar Knight to regionals and actually, gotten their invite, and some very rare instances actually have topped, because that's how good a deck like this still is, and it was one of the prime decks back in the Duelist Alliance format. Again, these are all decks that have had their time in the spotlight, but just because of power creep, they've kind of just been diluted in terms of their overall impact. It doesn't mean these decks are bad, but I think these decks can be incredibly powerful teaching tools, especially for newer players, and especially when you're getting into more advanced mechanics, like using Satellar Knight Trevere to bounce your Call the Haunted back to your hand so that you can reset it during your main phase 2, and kind of continue your loop with Altair and Deneb and keep your advantage going. Satellar Knights have a special place in my heart because I used to play the deck as well, and I think it's just a very good deck because it's simple enough that anyone can pick it up, but has a lot of potential the more you play around with it. Now, moving on to number 2, we're going to start getting into some decks that are actually a lot more competitive, but still serve as very good teaching tools, and that deck is going to be Stun. Now, Stun is a little bit of a glass cannon because if you lose the die roll, you're definitely at a disadvantage. However, modern day stun decks not only are affordable, but are really simple because your main objective is to summon a very powerful stun monster like, let's say, Thunder King Ryo, Fossil Dyna, or anything like that, set 5 back row, and just protect that monster with your life. And basically, with all the cards you're going to have at your disposal in tandem with those stun cards, you're going to be stunning your opponent so much that their plays are going to be so limited, and you're playing this control game to kind of just keep them on their toes while slowly picking away at their life points. Stun is still a very viable option even to this day, and it always will be, just because by being able to just take away mechanics that are so fundamental to the game, it really puts top meta players in an awkward position. Now, again, the deck does have its weaknesses, but I had to put Stun at number 2 just because it has the results to prove that it's been able to perform at a very good level. Now, from a teaching perspective, it doesn't really teach you good things in terms of, different types of summoning mechanics. It kind of just teaches you, to be an asshole more or less and kind of just ruin the fun of the game. But if you're a person that really likes to kind of go rogue and combat the meta in your own way, then stun decks might be for you, and it might be a good teaching tool maybe for a friend who wants to get into Yu-Gi-Oh! And they want to have a fair chance at a local or regional level without having to know too much about the game itself. Now, this brings us on to my number 1 deck for beginners, and that deck has to be Trickstar. Now, the reason I have Trickstar in the number 1 slot is quite simple. First off, Trickstar is one of the best decks within the past year, so the fact that it's very modern, very recent, relatively new compared to a lot of the other decks on this list, I think is very important. Now, another thing about Trickstar is that it has one of the craziest, most consistent, but also very basic engines in itself. You have a card like Trickstar Candina, which you're going to summon to add another Trickstar card to your hand. Ideally, you're going to bounce that Candina Candina back to your hand with a Trickstar Licorice, do some other plays, pass play back to your opponent, and then when your turn comes round again, you're basically going to be doing the same thing. You're going to normal summon your Candina, you're going to get something, and then ideally bounce Candina back to your hand in some form so that you have a follow-up play for the next turn. This is an extremely powerful engine, and because you have 3 copies of Candina, 3 copies of Terraforming, and 3 copies of Light Stage, you have a lot of power behind that consistency. Now, obviously Trickstar does have its downsides, being that it is a little bit weaker in terms of its offensive capabilities, but it teaches players not only how to make sure they keep their engine going, but it emphasizes resource management at that. You have cards like Trickstar Lilybell, which help you recur cards from the graveyard. Trickstar Light Stage is an incredible field spell because not only does it search for every card in your deck, but it also allows you to freeze your opponent's back row, and that's just a very powerful thing, having built-in spell and trap pseudo removal in your deck's searchable field spell. You've also got your back row with cards like Trickstar Reincarnation. Reincarnation's a very simple card, but it teaches you how you can banish trap cards during your opponent's turn to resurrect your own monsters, or even during your own turn to give you an extra monster to use so that you can maybe tutor for something in your extra deck. And you even got a card like Scapegoat, which can kind of teach you the fundamentals of Link summoning, but also give you good Link monsters to go into compared to something like what the starter decks might currently offer. While pure Trickstar is one of the most powerful decks, I also think it is an incredibly powerful teaching tool, and that's why I had to put it at the #1 slot. Now, guys, do remember, these decks are meant to act as a stepping stone for new players to get their feet wet and really understand Yu-Gi-Oh! At a fundamental mechanical level. But if you have a new player that you're teaching and they are a very fast learner and they really start to understand how the game is played, if they want to graduate onto something like Dinosaurs, Burning Abyss, or something that's a little bit more complex, more power to them. But everyone learns at a different level, and by trying to basically remove that barrier to entry for new players, that's why I wanted to bring you guys this video. And if you have a friend that has been dying to learn Yu-Gi-Oh! But you haven't had a good place to start, I really hope this video helps them out. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about any other decks you might think will act as good stepping stones for teaching new players how to play. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh! Content. And if you found this video helpful, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh! Content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.